Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at restorations and recoveries in 2 Kings chapter 8, although I'm tempted to give it a subtitle. It's going to be having a theme of kings, so I could call it When Kings Go Forth, or maybe The Coming and Going of Kings. Back in chapter 4 of 2 Kings, we had seen the story of the Shunammite woman, how she had been unable to have children, and she met Elisha, and he promised her a son, and the son was born, and then grew up, and then died, and then he raised the son from the dead. That was all in 2 Kings chapter 4. Now we see the same Shunammite woman. Her son won't be specifically mentioned. Presumably he's part of the household, and I don't know about her husband. He may have died by now because after all, he was elderly. But we're going to see a story involving her again, where her land is going to be restored to her after some famine travel. So let's look at the famine that's introduced in 2 Kings 8:1. Now, Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, "Arise and go with your household and sojourn wherever you can sojourn, for the Lord has called for a famine, and it will even come in the land for 7 years." Now, famines were serious things, especially in Israel, where if it doesn't rain, you're going to have a famine. In Israel, it rains in the winter months. That's the rainy season, and then the summer comes, and for 6 months it doesn't rain at all, except maybe a little bit right on the coast. So there's going to be a famine. Is it caused by lack of rain? Is it caused by global warming? I don't know what caused it. We're not told, but a famine was going to come on land, and that would be devastating. And so in verse 2, the woman arose and did according to the word of the man of God. That's Elisha. Sometimes he's called Elisha, sometimes he's called the man of God. And she went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. Now, I suppose there's other places she could have gone, but she goes down to that place along the coast. Remember, I said that sometimes it will rain there if you're on the coast. And so apparently the famine is hitting Israel, perhaps Judah as well, but it's not really hitting the land of the Philistines. So she goes and stays there. And of course, Israel is undergoing this famine. And at the end of 7 years, she's going to be returning to her home. Verse 3, at the end of the 7 years, the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went out to appeal to the king for her house and for her field. After all, it's been gone for 7 years. She's been gone for 7 years. And when you're gone, then somebody else comes in and takes the property. And apparently that had taken place. You couldn't just leave it unoccupied. Somebody was going to move in and take it for themselves. Verse 4, now the king was talking with Gehazi. Remember Gehazi? He'd been the servant of Elisha, the servant that had been stricken with leprosy. Is he still leprous? Or is this? I'm not necessarily sure that all of these stories are necessarily in chronological order. There might be a topical order. So I don't want to say for sure that the leprosy event had already taken place. It seems that way if the passage is in chronological order. And this is just, let me just say, this is going to be the last time we'll see Gehazi. He'll be mentioned here in these verses, and then we won't hear from him again. But the king was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, "Please relate to me all the great things that Elisha has done." As he was relating to the king how he had restored to life the one who was dead, behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life appealed to the king for her house and for her field. So here is Gehazi talking about these events, and then just at this time, the woman shows up, and Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son." He's still with her, who Elisha restored to life. When the king asked the woman, she related to him. So the king appointed for her a certain officer, saying, "Restore all that was hers, and all the produce of the field from the day that she left the land until now." I'm not sure how much produce of the field there was. After all, there'd been a famine. But she is restored with all that she had lost, just like she had a son who had been restored. Now the inheritance for her, but also eventually for her son, is also restored. Next story begins now in chapter 8 and verse 7. Then Elisha came to Damascus, And this is striking because the last time we read about Elisha, the king of Damascus had been out to get him. That king had been Ben-Hadad. Now, Ben-Hadad of Aram was sick, and it was told him, saying, the man of God has come here. You were looking for him before, and now here he is. But you're not really after him anymore, because that was when you were trying to conquer Israel and fight against Israel. But that's a thing of the past, because now you're just trying to stay alive. Verse 8, the king said to Hazael, and we're going to get to know Hazael. He's going to be a regular character from here on out. The king said to Hazael, take a gift in your hand and go to meet the man of God and inquire of the Lord by him, saying, will I recover from the sickness? So Hazael went to meet him and took a gift in his hand, even every kind of good thing of Damascus, 40 camel loads. And he came and stood before him and said, your son, and remember, this isn't a technical term, that Ben-Hadad isn't the actual physical son of Elisha, but rather this is an honorary term. You're considered, like, called the Holy Father. It's a high exalted term. So your son Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to you, saying, will I recover from this sickness? Then Elisha said to him, go say to him. Now notice Elisha doesn't say, yes, he will recover. He says, go say to him, you will surely recover. However, but the Lord has shown me that he will certainly die. You're going to tell him one thing, but the reality is something different. Verse 11, he fixed his gaze steadily on him until he was ashamed, and the man of God wept. That is, Hazael is looking at Elisha, and Elisha all of a sudden begins to weep, and Hazael says, why does my Lord weep? And then he answered, because I know the evil that you will do to the sons of Israel. Their strongholds you will set on fire, and their young men you will kill with the sword, and their little ones you will dash in pieces, and their women with child you will rip up. You're going to do some awful things against Israel. And Elisha is from Israel. But Hazael, doing those things against Israel, is going to be acting out the judgment of God. Not because Hazael is faithful toward God, but God is going to use him as a special tool to divide asunder kings and kingdoms. Verse 13, then Hazael said, but what is your servant, who is but a dog, that he should do this great thing? What do you mean I'm going to be doing? I'm a civil servant. And Elisha answered, the Lord has shown me that you will be king over Aram. Elisha is speaking to the next king who hadn't realized he was going to be the next king. He's realizing it right now. Verse 14, so he departed from Elisha and returned to his master, who said to him, what did Elisha say to you? And he answered, he told me that you would surely recover. Now that's the lie, and Hazael knows that it's a lie, but he repeats it. Verse 15, on the following day, he took the cover and dipped it in water and spread it on his face so that he died. Notice he doesn't wait for God to bring about the fulfillment. Rather, he decides, well, if you're going to die, there's no time like the present. And he assassinates the king of Aram, and Hazael became king in his place. So, summary of what we've seen up to this point, going all the way back to chapter 6, we had the king of Aram and Elisha, and then more recently we've been talking about the king of Israel and Elisha, and now we've returned to the king of Aram and Elisha, although we're going to see it's going to be eventually a different king. We had seen where Elisha had protected Israel, and Aram had made attempts to capture him, and remember how the Aramaic soldiers were captured. They were struck blind and brought to Samaria and then released. And then in that next section, we had the king of Israel ordering the death of Elisha when Samaria was surrounded and God had delivered the city of Samaria. And now we see the king of Israel showing respect to Elisha. And when Gehazi talks about what Elisha has done, the king says, whoa, I better act accordingly. And so this all takes place. That whole central section had taken place when Aram had laid a siege against Samaria. I'm not sure about those last few verses starting in chapter 8, verse 1. But previous to that, we had seen that story of the siege and how the Arameans had run away when they'd heard the sound of the chariots of the Hittites and of the Egyptians. And now, as we come to chapter 8 and verse 7, we had started off where Ben-Hadad of Aram is sick, and Hazael is sent to inquire from Elisha, and Elisha tells Hazael that he will be king to replace Ben-Hadad, and then Hazael makes it happen by murdering the king. Now we get to verse 16, and the scene changes back to Israel. Now, in the 5th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Jehoshaphat, being then king of Judah, Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, became king. So I know we've got 3 different kingdoms. We've got Aram in the north, and then Israel, and then to the south of Israel, we have the kingdom of Judah. So we're turning our attention now to the kingdom of Judah, and how Jehoshaphat is no longer going to be king. Instead, his son, Jehoram, and sometimes it will be called Joram, and sometimes Jehoram. It's just 2 different ways of saying the same name. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. Verse 18, he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done. For the daughter of Ahab became his wife, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, Jehoram, notice on the lower right-hand side, we've got Asa and then Jehoshaphat, and now Jehoram. He's become king over Judah. But his wife is the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab. Athaliah is her name. And Athaliah is a worshiper of Baal, and as she has come down to be queen of Judah, even though her brother Joram is king of Israel, she's come to be queen of Judah. She's going to bring nothing but evil against that house. Verse 19, however, the Lord was not willing to destroy Judah for the sake of David, his servant, since he had promised him to give a lamp to him through his sons always. And so even though we have a Baal worshiper coming to be queen of Judah, we're told, but that's not going to be the end of Judah. We're going to see hope and a return and eventually a restoration. Verse 20, in his days, Edom revolted from under the hand of Judah and made a king over themselves. Now, we've seen Edom sometimes on the side of Israel and Judah, but it has been a subservient position, and now it rebels against that and becomes an independent state, which it will retain for quite a long time. Verse 21, then Joram crossed over to Zair, and all his chariots with him. And he arose by night and struck the Edomites who had surrounded him and the captains of the chariots, but his army fled to their tents. So he goes back down to try to put down this revolt, and instead he's attacked, and he gets away. But that's all that happens. He gets away. Verse 22, so Edom revolted against Judah to this day, at the time that this portion is being written. Now, that doesn't mean it's necessarily all the way to the end of the book of 2 Kings. Sometimes we have written in here almost like the chronological accounts as they were taking place. So to this day, might be a bit short of that. Then Libnah revolted at the same time. So we were beginning to see a number of revolts against Judah. Verse 23, the rest of the acts of Joram and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Notice we went from Joram to Jehoram, and you can sort of mix and match those names. So Joram slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. That's telling you that you're talking about Joram. We've been calling him Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat. And Ahaziah, his son, became king in his place. And again, that's confusing because there's 2 Ahaziahs. There's one Ahaziah, that's the son of Jehoshaphat and Joram and Ahaziah. There's another one, notice on the left side of our chart, one of the sons of Ahab and Jezebel. And so we've got a number of sons having the same names. I don't think that's happenstance. I think that's somebody being named after their uncle. Verse 25, in the 12th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. And thankfully, we have that spelling alternated just so we can try to keep them apart when they're in the same sentence. Verse 26, Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri, king of Israel. Just to sort of let you know that, yes, that's not just like the daughter of a second wife or something like that, that she indeed goes back to the to that line all the way to Omri. Verse 27, he walked in the way of the house of Ahab and did evil in the sight of the Lord, like the house of Ahab had done, because he was son-in-law of the house of Ahab. And so here he is, Ahaziah, walking in his mother's footsteps. Stepmother, mother, not really sure. But there's an influence going on, and it's a negative influence. Verse 28, then he went with Joram, the son of Ahab. So Jehoram goes with Joram. Probably hard to keep their names separated. To war against Hazael, remember him, king of Aram. And the place where they have this fight is not in the territory of Aram, it's in the territory that properly belonged to Israel. But it's a border town, Ramoth Gilead. Whenever you see Gilead, that's on the east side of the Jordan River. So we've seen a number of cities with that Gilead name, Ramoth Gilead. And in the battle, the Arameans wounded Joram, that is Joram the son of Ahab. So King Joram returned to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds which the Arameans had inflicted on him at Ramah when he fought against Hazael, king of Aram. Then Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to Joram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel because he was sick. And our story ends here. You say, well, wait a minute, that's a terrible place to end the story. It's a little like one of those movies that comes not by itself, but in several different parts, and you come to the end of maybe the second part of a trilogy, and instead of having a good and proper ending, it's like, wait a minute, it's not really a cliffhanger, but there's a lot more story to come. And we're in the middle of the story, and all of a sudden we pause. And notice that the story pauses in this valley. Well, it's both a valley and a city. There's the city of Jezreel, and that city is located in the valley that gives name to the same place, this valley of Jezreel. Now, something about the valley of Jezreel. Maybe you've heard it not by that name, but by a different name, because there's another city further westward in the valley known as the ancient city of Megiddo. And you've perhaps heard of it not by that name, but by the name that it is given in the book of Revelation, Har Megiddo, or sometimes you say Armageddon. And the story pauses here in the valley that sometimes we like to call the Valley of Armageddon. Because there's more to come. There's judgment about to come. But it doesn't happen yet. And that reminds us of our story, because we're in the middle of a story too. You see, Jesus, the Messiah, has already come, and he's died on the cross and rose again. He made a payment for sin. He began the church, and we've heard that good news. We've heard the gospel, and we've believed in him. But the story's not over yet. The story's not over yet, and there's more to come, and there's judgment ahead of us. There's judgment symbolized by that reference to Armageddon. There's a second coming that is going to take place one day when Jesus comes again the second time to reward those who are his faithful people, but also to judge those who are not. And we live in the between times. We live in the pause between the place where we're at and, can I say it this way, the end of the movie. We're in that between time, and in this between time, the question comes up: are we among those faithful of God's, or are we the unfaithful? Are we symbolized by Elisha and the people that have heard his voice and followed him, or by these kings that, well, maybe they're not pagans, but they're certainly acting like it? And in the between times, it's very important because the end of the movie is coming. The Lord is going to return, And then that final judgment will take place.